We do have a recommendation and an item up from Commissioner Canati regarding the Parks and Environment Working Group. I'm going to be recusing myself from this conversation because the Long Center leases parkland and programs parkland, and I also sit on the board of the Shoal Creek Conservancy. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Vice Chair McGee to manage this this item.
Understood. Commissioner Canati, are you ready to present? You need to unmute.
I'm sorry about that. Just as a preliminary comment, I may not be reading the conflict provisions the same way, at least in terms of whether a board member of an organization in the parks and environmental space is conflicted from voting on this. And if I'm mistaken, I'm happy to be corrected, but I will just say I am a member of the Barton Springs Conservancy Board. This particular recommendation from the working group is not going to be affecting my organization in a specific way. I'm just, in the interest of full disclosure, I want to make sure at least I'm making that clear to everybody. But I have not practiced. Do I need to give any signals to
I'll bring it. This is the AV Tech. I'll go ahead and bring your PDF up. It's Parks and Environment Projects.
Okay. While that's pulling up, I'll just remind the commission that basically last February, we appointed a working group to look at a number of issues around potential use of hot funds. As you all may certainly recall, going back to the Visit Austin time and the hearings they had, and then continuing to the present, there has been many opportunities for folks to sort of look at different ways that hot funds could be expended and still meet with the state law restrictions on what is allowable uses of them. And so in February, we appointed a working group, which included 3 of the Tourism Commission members, Mr. Bunch, Ms. Fuentes, and myself. And then we had non-Tourism Commission members, representatives from the Austin Parks Foundation, Save Barton Creek Association, Peace Park Conservancy, the Hill Country Conservancy, and Shoal Creek Conservancy, and the Umlauf Garden, and the Trail Foundation. And we, over the course of these many months, have been meeting primarily by Zoom, as you might expect. We created a Google document and had a meeting to kind of take input from everybody on what we thought would be uses that are permissible under the state law regime. And we tried to identify some specific limitations that applied to each type of use. What was the statutory basis for different categories? Were there any geographic limitations on where you could spend money on these different categories? And so what you see here is the first page of a number of breakdowns of what we think are the different categories that could be expended in either a park or an environmental use to benefit, certainly tourism spots in the city, but the community as a whole at the same time. So I can kind of walk through the example here. One of the subcategories is basically advertising, solicitations, and promotional programs that promote tourism. And we have tried to say, as we read the state law provision, there really isn't any geographic limitation in the sense that the state law says, well, it has to be downtown or it has to be in the convention center. As we read that, there's no geographic limitation on where these funds could be spent. This is a category that does not have a statutory cap, in contrast to, for example, historic preservation funding and cultural arts. There's a 15% cap. There was an attempt to identify whether there's a minimum amount of funding this was a little harder to parse, and I'm sure Mr. Kozlov is going to be able to provide some insight into a lot of these issues. We did want to try to provide in each of these examples just some real world examples of where this funding already happened. So our understanding of where hot funds are currently being used to show this is not a completely imaginary application. And then we worked with each of our working group members to come up with a number of example projects that could be, as we saw it, funded with this category of funding. And so in this first page, you have a listing here of the ways that we think this category of funding could be used to promote tourism with, for example, hiring musicians to play in the parks. Certainly, we can think of a number of high-profile musical performance scenarios that draw tourists to Austin and in Zilker Park, for example, and some of the other parks around town and downtown area. Then this could be an example. If you can go to the next page, I will try to go through this next example a little. Whoops, we went 2 there. Here is a discussion of cultural arts and commercial music, which is probably all going to be very recognizable because this is what we currently fund at the 15% cap level with the city hot decisions to date. And so I will skip over that. At the next section there, we start at the bottom of the page with the category of visitor information centers. And so we list the statutory basis for how this funding is allowed. If you go to the next page, please. We point out that this category, visitor information center, is not limited to any part of town or the convention center per se. One of the interesting things about this category is the state law does provide for maintenance operation funding, which is relatively unusual. A lot of the other categories don't specify that you can use hot funds for maintenance and operation. This category does not have a cap, like a 15% cap. And we just gave some examples. Pretty much anytime you go into a small town in Texas and you see the little visitor center right in the middle of town, it's probably being funded in whole or in part with hot funds from that city. We did, again, working with the working group, come up with a number of projects that might be funded and in and around town. And these are part of what we've listed here. Some of this information you might recognize from the previous meetings from the Visitor Impact Task Force concerning the Zilker Park Visitor Center that could distribute information to tourists about our environment and the park and what to see in that area. Similar information centers could be put in other parks. Again, telling the story of our environment to the tourists who come to visit Austin to explore this part of our city. I will skim through the rest of these. The historic restoration and preservation category next is, again, one that we do fully fund at the 15% cap level, but we just walk through the same analysis. On this point, this is not going to be opening any doors for council to consider, since currently we do fund historic preservation projects generously. Could you go to the next page, please? We also tried to look at the wayfinding signage category that you see there at the bottom of the page and how that might be, maybe it's a relatively minor source of funding, but nonetheless, there are some projects that we have identified that could be funded to guide tourists through our parks with wayfinding and information. You know, it could be any of our metropolitan parks that tourists frequent. Next page, please. There's a discussion here about transportation systems for tourists that are a separate category provided in the Texas Tax Code. We think there might be some geographic limitations, at least as we understood the state law. There has to be maybe some connection of the transportation systems to be from a hotel to a commercial center, convention center, other hotel or tourist attraction. So that might be a geographic constraint on how this type of project is funded. Apparently, it does not include maintenance operation funding. And lastly, I'll try to gloss over. The last category was actually not under Chapter 351, which was the tax code provision we've been talking about so far. But as you'll recall, there's a venue tax provision, Chapter 334, which has its own separate requirements, including qualifying under state law and voter approval. But in terms of the specific projects that could be funded, we think we have identified that the venue projects defined in this category could support certain parts of parks and recreation systems and areas or facilities that are part of a municipal parks and recreation system. And if you go to the next page, this is a kind of a complicated drawing. What we've tried to show here is the state law is kind of confusing in this. It grants in part the ability to fund certain types of venue projects, but then it turns around in another part of the provision and takes away the ability to fund those projects in certain areas like the city of Austin. And so what we're left with is on the one hand, a grant, on the other hand, a partial pullback. And so what we have tried to identify at this part with what is not struck out in my fonting here, the types of projects that might be funded with a venue, Chapter 334 venue project. So this was the result, as I've said, of many years of receiving input and continued analysis by the Parks and Environment Working Group. And we wanted to recommend that the commission consider adopting this and recommending to council. I think if you can put up the other resolution, please. Do you have the proposed resolution there?
We're looking into that, sir.
Okay.
So Commissioner Canati, just for my clarity, the working group has a proposal, a resolution to propose to this body?
Yes, it's being loaded. It was on the backup materials. We tried to word this in a way that recognizes that the commission has already made certain recommendations, for example, about hot funds, to date. This resolution is seeking to say, well, there's other categories of what we see to be as allowable uses of hot funds. And we encourage that city council, you kind of see the bottom provision there of therefore, we're encouraging the council to consider this attached report and in finding ways to benefit the parks and environment projects in any future decision to allocate hot funds. So we're not saying you need to fund these particular projects, but you need to understand that these are permissible projects that we see as being allowable under the Texas state law restrictions. I will say I have not had the chance to see the opinion that Mr. Joslin was talking about, so this might need to be updated. But apart from that, I will just represent that we have been, as a working group, kind of plugging away at this since April. And I'm sorry it's taken so long to finalize this, but I'm hoping that the Tourism Commission would consider adopting this, or I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you have.
Commissioner Canati?
Yes, sir.
This is Scott, and had a question. Are these recommendations intended to complement the expansion of the convention center and not in lieu of the expansion of the convention center? What is your intent?
The intent, I think complement is the better word. I understand that this commission has already made a decision about the convention center. I'm not trying to undermine that, but I can imagine scenarios. I mean, it's possible, but unlikely perhaps that the city council decides differently, but maybe additional funds pop up that are not needed for the convention center. And this might